Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Aaron Shaw, and I'm faculty at Northwestern in Communication Studies. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to the latest installment of the Thought Leader Dialogue series hosted by the Center for Human Computer Interaction and Design here at Northwestern. This session is also kind of hosted and sponsored by the research group that I'm a faculty member in, the Community Data Science Collective. And we are really excited today to host a panel focused on decentralized and federated social media, and to think about some of the challenges and opportunities presented in that space, and to sort of spark that conversation and to provoke some thoughts and responses. We've got three really illustrious and accomplished panelists joining us today. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I will say that they encompass a variety of different perspectives, experiences, and areas of expertise relevant to the topic, relevant to the subject matter, and I think can speak from direct experience as well as a lot of kind of observation of others and deep understanding of the topic space, in terms of sharing their thoughts on the topics at hand. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll go in the order in which the panelists appear on my screen. So apologies in advance, but we'll start with Christine Lemmer-Weber and then go to Brian Newbold and then Jazz Michael King. So Christine, could you please kick us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Christine Lemmer-Weber. I'm the executive director at the Sprightly Institute, where we build kind of the next generation of decentralized network tech. Um, and you may know me from, I worked on the ActivityPub decentralized social network protocol, which connects together Mastodon, PeerTube, Funkwhale, etc. It is the most widely used, widely deployed, and widely implemented decentralized social networking web protocol that's ever been implemented. Not the most widely implemented decentralized social networking that's not Web one, that would be email. But nonetheless, we're kind of doing some new next generation stuff. Kind of what are the things that are hard to do? What are the things we can't do? And how do we make it so that secure and private peer-to-peer stuff is the default?
That was great. Thanks so much. I forgot one key, or really one key element of my request for introduction. So one you handled perfectly and anticipated beautifully, which was to help give us some context regarding your background and engagements in decentralized social media. The other one was if you'd be willing to share something about yourself that we probably couldn't find easily, at least on a search engine or LLM. Although, as one of the panelists pointed out before we started, since this is being recorded, we can rest assured that this will be going into the training data set soon. So we will be able to learn it. So keep that in mind.
Well, this is something you could find on an online training data set if you pushed really hard, because it is something I've said, but it's not something I say often, which is that even though I think I have the reputation of being this computer sciencey Lisp, like holding up structure and interpretation of computer programs person, when I was in college, I was like, oh, I'm really into this free and open source software thing. There's nowhere to make money on it. I'll become a writer and an artist to pay for my programming. And that's what I assumed I was going to do. I thought I was going to make a web comic to advance ideas of user freedom. And like in a certain sense I kind of did, because I've like made a lot of promotional artwork and animation for like the projects I've worked on. But um my background, like I'm a very hybrid person, and I love many different disciplines.
That may make you one of the first people I've ever heard who said that their plan was to have an artistic career as a backup for their technical and engineering pursuits. So that's great. Thank you again. All right, over to you, Brian Newbold, please.
I'm Brian Newbold. I'm a protocol engineer at Blue Sky. Blue Sky is a decentralized social web startup company that has a Twitter-style microblogging app, and we have built the product. So we basically kind of like built the product and the protocol at the same time. A protocol similar to and pretty inspired by ActivityPub called AT Protocol. I haven't thought about for a long time what that actually stands for, but it stands for the Authenticated Transfer Protocol. So it's a protocol that can also be used to build other applications and other things. And I'm sure we'll get into the kind of like design considerations and how it compares and contrasts with ActivityPub and other protocols in the long history of the web. My background a little bit, before this, I worked at the Internet Archive for about 5 years. And some of my interest in this was inspired by seeing at the Internet Archive, the web kind of not quite like dying, but shrinking, and a lot of interest from researchers and society in content that's on large closed social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook, and that being like this huge cultural artifact that's just kind of dark and inaccessible to other institutions like the Internet Archive or other people that want to have access to that kind of content for reasons other than making profit. A thing about me that doesn't show up on the internet, I think, until now, when I was in elementary school at a Montessori school, we made a time capsule, and I was pretty into computers already at that stage. So my contribution to the time capsule was putting a bunch of different physical media like floppy disks and zip drives, I think, at the time, and trying to think through like which media would exist and which file formats to use and not use proprietary file formats. And so I think that's actually like probably coming up around now that they might crack that thing open. So I should thank you for the prompt to go figure out what's up with that time capsule.
Head back to your Montessori school past and try to figure out if you can actually access the files. I feel like you'll have a pretty good chance of figuring out a way to help them access the files if anybody will. That's great. Thanks, Brian. All right, Jazz, please.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. I'm Jazz King, Executive Director of IFTAS. It's a nonprofit working on scaling trust and safety and content and conduct moderation in decentralized networks, building tools and resources for the volunteer cohort, connecting them to academic research and best practice. And my background, 20 years in healthcare, data and tech, security and privacy, regulatory concerns, as well as a strong background in healthcare cost and quality reporting. Started my first ActivityPub service in 2018, building a bilingual independent social network for Wales. And that sort of grew into my work with IFTAS. Something that isn't known about me, I'm a little older, so I get to have stuff that's not on the internet. I guess I was a lead singer in a punk rock band for many years. And I once owned a New Age supply store in South Wales.
Ooh, that's very nice. That's we'll see. Hopefully we won't be able to bring that back to haunt you, but yeah, no, that's great. I feel like I feel obligated that I should share a minor detail, an ungoogleable fact about myself too, which those who know me will know that I usually bike commute to campus. And something that I have told some of my undergraduate classes was that as a kid, I was sort of an unrepentant bike thief. And by kid here, I mean like 2-year-old. I would sort of show up at whatever playground in New York City my parents had brought me to and immediately just go over to whatever bicycle I could find and appropriate it as my own. So I've tried to get better at sharing over time. And try to be a little bit more respectful and, negotiate consent and boundaries and those sorts of things. But, my roots, I'm a bike thief. So anyway, on that note, so I wanted to start off with a question that would just open up the topic a little bit, especially, for folks who may not be as deep into the weeds and details about federated and decentralized social media systems already. Which is a question that you may get asked all the time, but just what is it? What's different about decentralized and federated social media systems? What differentiates them from other kinds of social media? And why do those differences matter? And just wanted to give each of you a chance to respond. If you could share a few thoughts there.
I can jump in for, and I'll phrase this a little like from the perspective of Blue Sky. I think like how we think about things and what our kind of goals are. And I'll take a pretty like economic approach, which is most of the existing social media platforms there's kind of a social contract, which is like there's one company and one platform, the operator of the platform, and they have exclusive economic power on that platform. Like there's a funny thing in the terms of service in a lot of platforms. Most of these are ad driven, that you can't advertise. And it's like it's funny that that ends up as a content moderation thing, that you like can't, you're not allowed to create content that is advertising unless you're paying them. And that's the deal, right? Like they're able to extract value from the platform. And what people using the platform get from that is they get free use of the platform, and the maintenance of the platform, and things like some degree of content moderation is done on the platform. And basically like the lights are kept off, and you make this, the arrangement is that there's this one controller of the platform that keeps the lights on and does all this stuff. And the trade-off is that they get to control how money flows on the platform, and they have economic control over it. And at least from the perspective of Blue Skies, we think that this social contract has not been very healthy, and it doesn't work particularly well. And we want to basically just change that one thing and say that there shouldn't be that contract. There shouldn't be one company that has exclusive economic control over a network. There should be multiple people that can make money, and those could be for-profit companies, they could be nonprofits, there could be any other number of model, and we don't really presuppose any one specific model of how it should work. Instead, we just think it shouldn't work that way, and that other people should be able to participate. And there's a whole box of other questions that come out of it, but that's like I would say our main kind of like thesis.
I'll jump in and give, I think that was a really nice and even kind of very nice policy oriented approach of looking at things. And I think kind of building on that, there are really two ways that I think about decentralized social media. Social media is an interesting term that we all kind of live with, but it's difficult to define what social media is. But for decentralized communication platforms, right? It's that I do think that from a technical perspective, it's how our message is sent, that the messages are not going through one giant source that's the omniscient technical controller, right? From a socio-political perspective, it's how do you have technology that permits and enables technology like communication, and not flow through one centralized provider. And in that sense, we protocols are themselves are not alone. I think I'm gonna leave it right here before I drop the bigger bomb on this on part two. But like the I think there's a great question about why it is that it's really hard to keep things decentralized for a long period of time. Um, but ultimately, the effort is to try to keep the the consolidation of power out of specifically just a few individuals, and permit on the freedom to permit communities to be able to decide governance structures that are really important and relevant to them that may be otherwise excluded.
Yeah. Even though I'm a tech guy, I care less about federated and somewhat less about decentralized, although it's important now, but more importantly, open. Closed systems could federate, and we've seen that begin to happen. I'm much more interested in the use of web standards to make sure we continue to keep the web open. I think Christine raises an interesting point. We label this social media because we've allowed ourselves to become accustomed to a norm that is closed, large, omniscient social media governance. But elsewhere on the web, nowhere else do we have that norm, nor would we suffer it. We wouldn't allow what is currently in place for social media in our texting or our phone calls. So for me, it's very much about, Christine got to this too, culturally sensitive local governance, and freedom to operate regular human communications planet-wide, without a handful of men in a small area of a state of a country deciding who and when your message is delivered.
Thanks, all three of you. Those were great and deep answers, I think, and really get beyond. I think often initial attempts to explain this that I've encountered emphasize the technical piece first, usually the protocols, um, the fact that the systems are built around a distinct technical standard that enables a certain amount of interoperability and affords a certain amount of autonomy to communities or servers that adopt them. Um, but I appreciate that all three of you really leaned more strongly into what I see as sort of the social dimensions that, or the social conditions that those technical standards create. Um, yeah, I don't know if any of the three of you have follow-ups. Also, before I wanted to mention to the folks attending that you may have seen the Q&A feature is enabled, and we've got some. We'll do our best to attend to questions, and we might try to hold them till the end, I think. But we'll leave about 20 minutes for Q&A towards the end. But as stuff comes up, if folks have comments, really welcome those. I see we got at least one that came in already. So let's, please feel free to keep the Q&A coming. I'll do my best to kind of funnel them into the conversation as best I can. But yeah, to go back to the panelists, this dimension and this tension, or I don't know if it's a tension, right? This contrast between technically centered explanations of the space versus more socially centered explanations, and what you make of that. Would love to hear any thoughts you have.
Well, there's no such thing as apolitical designs, right? Because you end up there's that Conway's law says that Conway's law says that the design of some sort of system resembles the way that the organization communicates, right? And then but it runs in reverse, right? The system that the kinds of communication you're able to have are also informed by the kind of designs that you have, right? So these two things actually go together. And sometimes you see people say, no, 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 it's a political issue. No, it's a technical issue. And I'm just like, ugh. And I'm like, and I mean, as in terms of like what is the purpose of decentralized network protocols? I mean, obviously they're to make you lose years of your life sitting in a standards committee. But aside from that, um, they should be to be able to set up the foundational structures to be able to permit, from my perspective, the agency of people to be able to better communicate, right? To the agency of people to be able to build, right? And I don't, I think we can get. So I think that there's 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 not really a dichotomy in what it really is that there are two angles to a problem that need to be solved, right? And of course, there's a lot of time that we end up spending in the engineering side of things, and when you spend a lot of time talking about the engineering side of things, you can lose people one direction. But if you also have people who are just thinking about the social problems, they might not realize how one of their solutions might actually cause more social problems, right? This is very common. If you look at board game design, this is very common where people are like, oh, this thing's really annoying, we'll just outlaw X, and then it ends up creating 10 new problems, right? So you actually have to have a feedback loop between kind of the technical structure and also the social spaces you want to be able to create.
So I got my start in the web on the web in the 90s. Things were going crazy, and I spent the first 5, 6, 7 years building online communities. And something that has come to me in my gray bearded years is technology is great, and community governance is great, but I feel as a technologist, I'm guilty of this, spending far too much time trying to reinvent something that already exists, which is human communication. And I feel I want to worry less and less about the technology, about the protocol. I certainly want to worry not at all about having to explain it to someone so they can use it. It should be invisible to just like texting on your phone. No one cares how that works, or very few people care. And the tech can sometimes outpace the reminders that what we're trying to emulate, what we're trying to build is the kind of community and interconnection that we have with people local to us in the same space and time, and to grow that across space and time so that we can communicate with folks, out of order of time or at a very large distance from us. And so I guess I'm trying to say, I really hope that the evolution of where we're going is that we care less and less about the tech and more about making sure that whatever we're building, whatever we're designing, whatever we're implementing, whatever government structures we're putting in, we're not trying to reinvent human communications. We're trying to make sure it can continue and continue to serve humanity globally.
I think, I mean, a big thing I think is just we're I don't know what generation we're at now, but we're like several generations into trying to design socio-technical systems on the internet. And there, many like people have been trying for a long time to be like, oh, let's come up with a set of technical properties that will have the social outcomes we want. And that's just like not, I think everyone, this is like maybe a debate 15 years ago, but like everyone's like pretty moved beyond that. There are still a couple, like you can still nudge pretty strong. And I think we try to do that. We try to identify like what are some key properties, like what are some abilities, what are some kind of like social contracty things. And then we can, to some degree, a little bit technically try to ensure that those things are easy so that like we can try to make water flow downhill in certain directions. But water's going to flow uphill. A lot of this, especially a lot of our focus at Blue Sky is on like very large scale public conversations, which have their own, which is somewhat controversial. Like maybe a lot of the problems with social media is that you're trying to get 100 million people in one room and they're all just shouting at each other. And this is like, that's actually the problem. We're trying to make that work still a little bit. And we think about that we spend a lot of time trying to, maybe that's making water flow uphill in some way, but we just know people are gremlins, or that there's like moneyed interests that are going to try to like abuse the system. They're going to try to drag it, right? Like you can't go into this being like, we'll design it, we'll set the rules and everyone will just follow the rules. People are going to try to take it and pull it and like abuse it and do it in the wrong ways. So it's just trying to like set a couple principles or ways or dynamics, but it's really just trying to set the tone and the norms, the expectations. So it's like the culture and the expectations and kind of the social contract that people have when they're using the system are what we think will like hopefully or potentially last over a long time and can stick. And it's kind of just showing a way. It's like showing a demonstration of like, it could work in this way. And if we build a system that demonstrates that, then the actual technology, and to some degree, I mean, I think protocols are a very strong and standards are a very strong social norm and a really good tool of like, how should the governance work? But I think on their own, they're not going to like you have to show it. I think ActivityPub has really succeeded at this, right? Like it demonstrated like a vision of what the norms would be and how conflicts would be resolved socially. And they've succeeded in that mostly from this cultural aspect of like demonstrating it in the real world with real groups of people. And so we're trying to do that as well with some of the ideas that we have. I think that connects back to the original question of like technical, like where the technical and social things are. I think there's a little bit, I mean, another way to frame it would just be like, it's like, are we trying to be a little like prefigurative? Are we trying to like have some vision of how we want the internet to work? Like what's the social structure and the social norms we want? And sometimes you can just look at that and be like, well, you would need this technology to enable that. If you just build the technology to enable it, that's totally insufficient to actually have that outcome take place, right? You kind of have to like seed some communities, you have to seed some norms, you have to have examples, you have to like show people the vision of it.
No, I mean, these were great responses. I mean, I think for me, it really underscores. I mean, like you're preaching to the choir. My background is trained as a social scientist, and I'm here as a faculty member of an HCI center that focuses on socio-technical elements of design, computing, online interaction, computer-mediated interaction, right? So I think, to me, the language of norms and agency and connection, right, enabling these sorts of social capacities and capabilities in ways that support communities to work autonomously or to work to do what they want to do, knowing that's sometimes gonna unearth some gremlins, as you put it, Brian. Right, I think that that resonates in a lot of ways for me. I mean, I think the one of the things that I think your responses underscore is how far from the sort of technical solutionism that's been pervasive in a lot of these conversations in the last 20 or 30 years. The folks active in decentralized and federated media have moved. Not that it's totally gone, not that it's totally absent, but I think it's a different conversation. Maybe along kind of distinct lines. The next question I had was really to ask you to think about critical challenges or risks that you see in the moment in the space. I wanted to add one wrinkle to that, which is sort of given that the three of you have been active in, whether it's decentralized protocols or communication systems or other sorts of, sort of adjacent communities, I'll say. I'm curious what you see as some of the biggest accomplishments as well. So maybe if we wanted to start with what do you think of, like, looking now at the landscape of, whether it's ActivityPub or Blue Sky or across the kind of federated community space as a whole, what do you see as some of the accomplishments that when you step back a little bit, might make you go, wow, that's something, maybe that's exciting. And then from that, what do you see as the biggest challenges and risks that are ahead?
I think I'm going to drop a bomb on this one, and then I maybe need to mute myself for a while because I think it's going to be maybe a big one. Because and I'm going to kind of counter some stuff said in the previous section. Because let me be the technical logical solutionist. Because let me open with a space of optimism. Yay! Like we've got ActivityPub, we got like millions of users, yay. Blue Sky's got a bunch of people, yay. Like this is great, right? We've got a lot of implementations. We actually did it more than we've ever done it before. It might not be everybody, but we're actually seeing that this stuff, mostly works. But on the other hand, like we've seen SMTP/email, was our first decentralized social network. And we had XMPP as a success beforehand. And they failed. They failed as being decentralized networks, right? Like I ran an email server for so long and I gave up this year. And I gave up because I needed to do fundraising for my organization. I couldn't reach people that I needed to reach. And I was like, I'm giving up. The big players won. Right, the big players won. And with XMPP, if you use Jabber XMPP, it was amazing for this time. Google Talk came out, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. Like everybody's like on my contact list, and then Google's like, we're shutting that down. And then it's just like ghost town, right? All of our stuff is going in the direction of email and XMPP. We're going back down the centralization path. And let me tell you why. The reason why is because we're reproducing from the perspective of, I think, the directions of kind of, how Twitter, Facebook, etc., like a lot of those ideas end up becoming pervasive in it, and that ends up informing it. But it's also because there's this whole direction. I'm going to get into object capability security if I'm not careful, and I'm not going to. That term is important. It's really relevant to Sprightly. But the real problem is it's way too hard to build this stuff, and all of it is doomed to re-centralization in the current form. ActivityPub, in the way that it's currently deployed, AT, also doomed to re-centralization. All of it in its current design is doomed to re-centralization. And I think what the only path out of there actually is some kind of fundamental restructuring. I do think there's great research happening in all of these spaces, but part of the problem is that if you try building this type of stuff on top of current contemporary technology, you have to spend massive amounts of domain expert stuff to be able to create a peer-to-peer application. When you think of what's the hard thing to do a peer-to-peer application, you're like, okay, we've got to start with, like, we got to get all the experts in the room to be able to build this one application. No, what we need is technology where every application is peer-to-peer by default and has the security designs that are built into it. And the security designs are only half the security, right? In the Sprightly Institute, we're focused on two things. One of them is on the security and privacy side of things and secure computation. But the other side of things is in terms of the social patterns, is in terms of how you end up creating consensual communities that have better governance structures. And all, like, the allow list, deny list approach always re-centralizes. Like all of that type of stuff always re-centralizes. There are other patterns that have been researched, but they've been sitting on the shelf for a long time, and it's partly because a centralized perspective really encouraged it to be put on the shelf. And part of the reason Sprightly happened is that when we tried, one of the experiences I had was, okay, let me try to explain some of these ideas of something where we can do peer-to-peer by default. We can do these kinds of like peer-to-peer style designs, these kind of object capability security style designs. And I would speak to people who were using the current kind of pieces of technology, and they just could not conceive of how to be able to implement it. With the stuff that we're building now, it falls out by default. Many of the applications, we write them and they just by default are peer-to-peer and so on and so forth. So this is a ramble and this is a rant, but the future of technology should be that all technology is peer-to-peer, consensual, and secure by default. That's the default easy path. You should not need to get a giant group of people together in a room. And doing that requires enough sufficient research and foundation laying so that that becomes the default. And we've had this happen before. The fact that we're all able to use SSL, right, TLS on our connections, right, not have to understand that and have a secure connection. The fact that we're able to use TCP and all these other types of things was because of publicly funded, like commons oriented research that was looking at foundations. And we really need to do some foundational research. So I'm going to say, yes, I care about the social side of things and I focus on the social side of things. And I'm really glad that Mastodon was adopted by a bunch of queers because it made sure that the Fediverse had a good environment. But what technology we have enables what our limits are. And I want to not see the failed state, I didn't mean failed state in that way, but I'll take it, of email and XMPP to keep happening to our systems. And now I'll mute myself for a while.
That was great. Thank you. Got applause in the chat. Brian or Jazz, tough act to follow. Either of you want to jump in?
There's a lot of thoughts there. There's a lot I could grab onto. I think I really like, just on a personal level, like what motivates me and what I think of in the future, like what am I like optimistic about or not? Like I'm very focused. I focus a lot on role models. Like, is there a role model project? Like, is there something else I can point to that was actually technically good, had a sustainable business model or some revenue stream, and like actually had real people used it and it was successful. Like a huge shining light for me of this generation of technical projects was the Signal project and the Whisper protocol and libsignal. It's interesting because it's not a standard. There's no standard. It's just a nonprofit that puts out some tech. It's been very, very influential in my opinion. There's a lot of other projects in the space. It builds on other work. It's not like it's the one thing, but I refer to it constantly as like a big success in an area where there's like been a lot that has not gone well, right? Like chat is quite centralized. Like there's almost everyone is using these, like people are largely moved away from SMS and MMS into these proprietary platforms, which have like, and for better or worse, like many of them have now adopted the Signal protocol or something very close to or inspired by it. And more so than that, it just shows like it's an example where it's like, oh, they're like, we can do this. Like we could build a open thing that tens of millions of people might actually use. Like if there wasn't that, it's like very easy to get depressed and just be like, these huge companies are all winning. They're winning so hard and so fast. It's so hard to compete with them. They have such big engineering teams. So to me, it's like these existence proofs. And that's like, I don't know, like it's a little bit of some of that flavor of like the prefigurative thing earlier, where it's like, can you see, like, is there a vision of how this would go? And something like Signal has like huge, like I don't even care if the protocol is good or not, or if it's standard or something, right? Because they've just shown that it's like possible, and it's like the social aspect of it. Like they were able to make it successful. They were able to find funders. They were able to find, like they're just able to make the whole thing work. And it's all that like extra glue work at the end that's so hard. So I'm a fan.
I mean, back to your question, achievements and risks. Like I said, I'm trying to focus less on the tech. Tech is important, and technologists should worry about it. But if we stick with the term social media, decentralized social media. I guess one question that I have is, what is decentral? Is it down to the individual? Is it billions of decision makers? Um, is it community leadership? Is it community governance structures? Is that recentral? Is it, I see activity pub service popping up in Tunisia and Australia and Chile, and they're central to their culture and their language and their space. But is that decentralized because it's not, U.S. based? So, and again, having some gray hairs, I've seen a lot of things be adopted by many. I too ran my own email server for as long as I possibly could. I think there's a natural cycle online and off to this, whether it's sociopolitical, whether it's technological, but there are definitely cycles in what we want and what we expect. And I think in these current times where we are in an increasingly evolving regulatory environment that itself is pushing back from Australia, from the EU, from the UK, from Canada, from others, against what they perceive as centralization, by their definition of it being not them, and centralized to a North American perspective, and that flowing down to individuals. And I think it's not inconsequential that 15 million people, 16 million people have signed up for an account on a thing that 15, 16 million of them don't understand exactly what it is. So the risk for me is sustainability of that at scale while we ride that flux. I think there's 27,000 activity pub services. I don't know how many app protos repos are running. There's Nostra, there's thousands and thousands of people diving in. Many of them, of course, technologists, many of them community leaders or community managers who would like to care less about that technology. And one thing that the tech has done for us, especially with cloud deployment and where we're at now versus where we were 20, 25 years ago, is you can set up one of these technologically based community services for like $5 a month. And that's a lot of money for some people, but not a lot of money for others. And it's fascinating to me to watch this explosion, knowing that it will recoalesce to some level, but I'm interested to see what the natural level of that re-centralization might look like. Is it 1,000 service providers? Is it 10,000? Is it 500? Is it 5? I don't know. But helping it on the up curve now and sustaining it at scale, especially from my perspective, from a trust and safety perspective, is the risk that I'm paying attention to.
If I could jump in one little thing that touches on a point in there, and from the original question of like things that we're proud of or like accomplishments, this is kind of a weird underselling one, but one of the things I'm weirdly kind of proud of with Blue Sky is we have a community of people that hate protocols. Like they don't want us to be distracted by it. So they're always like, you nerds, stop it. Like, just give me gifts. Like, just like stop doing this protocol stuff. Just make it a centralized platform. No one wants this decentralized stuff. No one cares. Stop it. And we've retained them. Like, they still use Blue Sky because we built something that like doesn't require them to kind of like buy into it. That's not like, I want people to appreciate it in the long run, but like I have a little bit of pride that like we built something. I don't know. I could see people could criticize this easily, I think, right? That we've like recreated a lot of the experience of the centralized platform. But for it was a big part of our approach and values was to try to meet people where they are and like build something that was like, you didn't have to compromise. Like, you didn't have to accept a lower, whatever silly little thing it is, like latency or whatever. Like, there was like no compromise. You could have it be more decentralized without it. Yeah. Anyways, I think you get the point.
That's a great point. I mean, I think I think there's several threads to pick up here, and we're getting awesome questions in the chat. So I want to start working a few of those in. I mean, one question that maybe is worth bringing in here came from a doctoral student who's done a bunch of research in the space, Carl Kohlgleiser, which is about whether decentralization in this sense is kind of an end of itself, right? Or whether it's really there to just sort of advance these other values, create these other opportunities, or or I would even go past that, right? Is it a lever that is just purely tactical to kind of push back against some of the forces of centralization that the three of you have spoken about, right? Where you kind of grab what you can grab to see what you can pull on at the time. I'll leave that one, and then I've got a follow up as well.
Food isn't an end into itself, and yet it's something that people enjoy and care about. There's lots of things that life's too interconnected for anything to be an end in itself. Is my perspective.
Yeah, I'll just say I've stopped saying decentralized. I say independent a lot, and I'm not sure that's the right term either. But when people ask me what is this thing, um, explaining why it's decentralized, how it's decentralized, why it federates, what federation means, nobody cares, right? They just want to connect. They want to see their nieces, they want to see cats, they want to form groups of best practice, they want to commune with people in a particular language or around a particular cultural phenomenon. And like I said up front, I care less and less about decentralized. I find it to be a response to a new norm that was never a norm. It was never an intended norm of the consolidation of the web services, especially in what we call social media. But we had bulletin boards and we had blog rolls and web rings and we've used the web for quite some time to interconnect. And there's a generation or two that I don't know if it's part and parcel of the device and the proximity of the device, but this new normal that there are certain ways to get your videos and certain ways to get your short text blurbs and certain ways to get your long form. No one came up with that. We never invented that. We didn't want that. The whole thing was open, world wide web. We've stopped saying that. And I think it's vital we get back to that. It is a world wide web. It is one of the greatest gifts to humanity, one of the greatest inventions we've ever come up with. And so, when we talk about decentralization, we're talking about a blip in time of a thing that wasn't supposed to be. I think most of us probably don't like. And we're working on correcting that, course correcting that. And sure, decentralized, independent, federated messaging is how we get there. But yeah.
Yeah, it's not. I would make a questionable connection to like market economics, and so to me, it's not about in that analogy, it's not about decentralization for the sake of decentralization. It's about like is the political economy healthy? Like, are people are things help? Like, so in a very concrete sense, one question I have a little bit like my personal feelings about this, or maybe a little different from like the approach Blue Sky is taking, and I agree with the approach the company's taking. To be clear. One, like we get criticized a lot. I think a lot about there's this guy, David Rosenthal, who comments a lot on things like cryptocurrencies or decentralized. And he's basically very critical of almost everything that calls itself decentralized, because it's not actually decentralized, right? A lot of these projects have this really cool peer-to-peer program protocol or some peer-to-peer thing. In fact, it ends up being almost everyone in one place. Like a good example of this is Git. Git is this really cool technology that's used by software developers. So it's probably not super well known outside of that field, but it's like extremely popularly used in the software development field. And it's decentralized. It's a decentralized version control system. And there doesn't need to be one centralized server. And almost everyone uses this product called GitHub, which is owned by a company called Microsoft. So it's like super centralized in a way. Like it's a very decentralized technology, but it's re-centralized into this one thing. And to me, there's like a question of like, is that how much of a problem is this? Like, is it causing big problems to people? And there are alternatives, and people do use other alternatives. But I think there's at least a big advantage in that. So someone like David would look at this and be like, it failed. The whole project failed. The whole attempt was like, it's not real. Like there's market consolidation. They failed at what they were trying to do. I think GitHub, and Microsoft are like still quite like constrained in what they can do. They have a lot of like pressure in what they can't set prices. They can't just do whatever they want, because it's still quite easy using the technology to switch to other things. And that's not just because of the technology and because they're using it. It's because there's this whole ecosystem of these other market alternatives and other things like this. And so to me, I think this is like a kind of an open question. Do you need, like, is it really decentralized if there's not like one player has more than 10% of people using the technology, or one player has more than 50%, or one player has more than 1%, right? Like, is there some number is that what matters? Does it matter that there's actually a huge number of small people providing the service, and that any form of centralization, like any large player in the ecosystem, means it's failed? Or is it the kind of like guarantees of the technology or the network or whatever? Like, you have some credible, we talk internally at Blue Sky a ton about credible exit, that people can credibly leave. And so if Blue Sky became evil or became shitty and we started exploiting our users, do they credibly have a way to exit from us? I think we're not quite there yet. I think we've designed the protocol quite well, but we need at least like a GitLab to our GitHub that's like somewhere people could go to. But I think we've kind of defined success as like these properties like credible exit. That's sufficient. Like, we don't actually need like there shouldn't be any one player that has more than 5% of people in the network. I think there's like totally reasonable debate on this. Like, I think a lot of people say, no, what you really need is lots of small players. If you have market consolidation, you've failed.
Another question that came to us from Andres Monroy Hernandez is about a related point, which is about, at this point there are multiple protocols in the space, as well as multiple entities, companies, nonprofits, autonomous community groups, you name it. So at the protocol level, there's AT, there's ActivityPub, there's Noster, there's others. I'm sure there's many that I've never heard of. Right? Do you think that there's value in having sort of diversity or diversification at that level? Or do you think that the system would be maybe better off with some amount of consolidation? I don't know if we need to call it centralization, maybe standardization at that level. Right? Like, in terms of thinking about the different layers at which centralization and standardization might occur, what do you see as some of the benefits, trade-offs, downsides to the way things are and the way you see them moving?
What's easy to forget is that we have had massive consolidation before ActivityPub happened. The reason I got involved in the ActivityPub protocol is there was Diaspora, there was StatusNet with Open OStatus, there was a whole bunch of different things. There was like Friendica, there was like a bunch of, there was like something called Elg or something like that, and they all spoke different things. They were all incompatible with each other mostly, right? So we ran this big effort to try to consolidate, create a protocol that a lot of different things could adopt, and we succeeded, right? We managed to get out a protocol that lots of different pieces of software adopted, right? And that was a big multi-year standards effort. But I think that there's still a lot of interest. I don't have that much interest in spending most of my focus on the building a decentralized Twitter or Facebook version of things anymore. I think we've already done that, and that's cool. And like, in fact, we beat them because Twitter's now X Twitter, and it used to feel like this impossible giant, and it's it really seems like it's mostly crumbling now. And same thing with the blue site of Facebook, and in fact they're adopting ActivityPub, and whether or not that's a good thing or not, it's but there's more work to be done, right? So I think that there's still a lot of other interesting things to do. Perceiving things in terms of the framing of what social media is from a particular, 2010s era of things, I think is a pretty limited view of what things could become.
I agree pretty strongly with Christine, or like in particular, I'd also loop back to something she said earlier, which was like, we need to make it so that when people are building new things in the future, the obvious thing to do is make it decentralized. The obvious thing to do is make it peer-to-peer. Like we should have kind of like frameworks or technologies or protocols or whatever that when you're sitting down to start, like we can't just fight like the last fight or the previous generation stuff, and we can't just recreate these existing products. We need to make it that like when new young folks are building some new thing, that there's like it's easier to do it with these values and this like decentralized design. So that to me is kind of the long goal, right? Is that like in 5 or 10 years that developers that are starting new things would do things that way. As to whether like it's a sensitive subject, right? Like there's Jay, the founder of Blue Sky, spent a lot of time looking at ActivityPub when we started our project and whether we should adopt ActivityPub or build our own things. The way I frame it in my mind is that we're coming from like very different branches historically. So like the social web and kind of web technology branch of the technology family was like kind of like RSS and the classic, HTML and HTTP. And our, StatusNet, Pump.io, almost everything consolidated into ActivityPub from that side of the family. There's a whole other branch, which was like maybe kind of GNU-Net or these peer-to-peer things like BitTorrent, which is not really a social media thing, but there was Secure Scuttlebutt and that, and this other family of more content addressed more directly peer-to-peer and not mediated by a server, not using web technology things. And they're kind of coming at each other. Like AppProto comes from that family. A lot of the people that have worked on it and did the initial design worked on those previous protocols, and it's moved a lot in the web direction. And ActivityPub, in my feeling, has like moved a fair amount towards the peer-to-peer direction, and it just feels like they are converging. Like I don't know. I can't imagine that they're not going to like collide in some future, 5 or 10 year timeline and become more similar to each other. Jazz, I don't know if you have like a.
So I'm hesitant to say it. May 1,000 flowers bloom, but may none of it stop me from communicating with Bob and Llandoffrey in Wales, right? Because we're on the different thing, and I think there's likely to be some coming togetherness where we get to cherry pick the best of all options. The web has evolved time and again, but it's bound by the interconnectedness of all things. And I am unabashedly a standards person. I love standards. It helps people get into the space. It helps people know what to build on top of. It accelerates our ability to build contextually relevant platforms of those protocols. I'm all for platforms doing different things in different contexts for different groups of people, but I'm just a proponent of standards. So I will cautiously put forward that I hope in the next 3 to 6 years we land somewhere where there's a singular defining worldwide protocol for this kind of messaging. But there's no hurry. We get to figure it out like we figured everything else out by throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Thanks, all three of you. Those were thoughtful responses to that. I really appreciate it. There's a couple of questions that have come up that I want to try to mash up a little bit. So apologies to the question askers if I'm not doing justice to exactly the thing you were focused on. But they have to do, and maybe this is going to nudge this a little bit more into your part of your kind of core interest these days, Jez, which they have to do with some of the social challenges, failures, problematic dynamics that have emerged in a number of different social media systems and communication platforms in recent years. which is, you've all made this case for supporting kind of the fluorescence of human communication and autonomy and supporting agency and autonomy. And at the same time, I think that decentralized and federated systems, have run into many of the challenges and concerns that have surfaced in the more centralized corporate platforms as well, whether that is, kind of the broad umbrella of trust and safety, or specific considerations around facilitating echo chambers or polarization, or at least sort of extremist interaction. Um, and so I'm curious what you see as the are there particular tools or approaches that you think are in the kit for ActivityPub, for Ad Protocol, for Blue Sky, for some of the networks that we're seeing emerge and grow? Are there particular kind of social solutions to this? I mean, at a minimum, maybe Des, you could say a little bit more about what it is that IFTOS tries to do. I think not everyone in the session probably knows very much about IFTOS's work. But I'm curious also where you see, each of you, where you see the different opportunities and constraints along solving some of those really tough, sticky problems that we've run into in terms of interactive communication systems online.
So I'll jump in as you named me. Once a month, every second Sunday, I hold a what you call in America a potluck. I have to call it the potluck roast or whatever. And I invite neighbors into my house once a month, and they can bring food or not. They can talk about whatever. They can sit wherever they want. They can come and go at whatever time they please. And it's a joyful experience of people coming together, and sometimes people haven't met before, meet each other, and so forth. And if I, at that potluck, allowed someone to come in and walk around to each person and yell at them about how they were wrong about something, or how they weren't paying enough attention to something, or just generally being, uncivil and rude, my guests would expect me, as the convener, as the community leader, to do something about that, and rightfully so, I think. Although now that I described that, I kind of want to do it once just to see what happens. But my point is, at no point during this hypothetical situation would I blame the builder of my house for not providing me with the tools to manage my potluck. And again, I harken back to, we already communicate. It's a thing we do. It's built in, and I don't want to say blankly technology doesn't solve it, but I do want to say protocols don't solve it. But what my house builder did do is he put doors on the house and locks on those doors, and windows that open and close. And I get to use or not use the doors and the windows as I see fit while I manage the community of my house. So it's a long-winded way of saying it is really easy, and we've seen some of this. Again, I want to be cautious. I'm not casting aspersions. I love technical innovation. I am a technologist. It is really easy to adopt a protocol and let people talk to each other. We've seen it happen in sort of less than 48 hours. You can just happen upon it, fire something up, create an implementation, and wow, people are talking to each other. And you've built a house, but you have not built any doors or windows or locks. And furthermore, you've forgotten that that thing you built will be inhabited by a community leader or a community government structure, or some essence of folks who will want to establish their sociocultural norms. So at IFTOS, very briefly, I won't go too long into this, but IFTOS is hopefully the first of many, because I certainly do not want to be part of the decentralization of things. But one of, I hope, many means of convening the folks who are taking on those problems, who are taking on conduct and content moderation, trust and safety, security, personal digital safety, for the folks who stand up and do that. And this was created specifically as a nonprofit because I believe that I believe that this communication, the global communication itself, should be a nonprofit endeavor, and I certainly believe that the folks who support that should be a nonprofit endeavor. I believe this is a public commons. I believe this is a common good. And so IFTAS very simply convenes active moderators in decentralized spaces. We wouldn't say no to other moderators, but that's where our focus is. We crowdsource best practice, we crowdsource resources, we raise money and buy things that individual community managers, moderators, and service administrators couldn't afford by themselves, to help smooth this along while we get to the next set of bigger problems, when I'm sure that are coming, larger entities will be in the space. And so, as I hearkened to before with the regulatory environment, we do things like we've published a DSA guide in lay terms for folks who have stood up a pixel fed or a Mastodon server, whatever. We've put together moderation guides and some shared vocabularies around what is moderation, what are the harms, what words do we all use. We're working on translation projects now to make sure that folks in languages other than English can consume that content, and basically trying to add some robustness, add some integrity to the trust and safety community, so there's room for continuous improvement, best practices, collaboration, that sort of thing. And you know, we're relatively young. We incorporated in August of last year, but we didn't really get started till November by the time we got some money. So there's lots of activity going on there. But to your point, we're not building any tech. We're building a very small amount of tech, as little tech as possible. As I tell my wife, it's 2023. Of course, we're using technology. It's 2024. So but you know, we're not tech focused. We're focused on convening the people who are trying to use the houses and the doors and the windows, and trying to make sure that the people building the houses are remembering that when you have your potluck, you may occasionally need to eject an itinerant guest.
Building on that, I think the potluck example is great. I think the pointing out the windows and doors is great, because you're not going to blame. You're taking some responsibility for the curation of things within your house and etc. It would be a completely different scenario if you said, let me throw a citywide, countrywide, worldwide potluck, and I'll moderate that, right? And this is effectively what, and this is part of the reason I'm a little bit on the term social media. There's this kind of like venture capitalist funded 2000s, 2010s era version of social media where there's this vision of a public town square. Bunch of bullshit. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as a public town square. There's no such thing as a global community. Those don't exist. There's no such thing. You don't have those. Um, and so the question of like how are we going to be doing things in Sprightly? If you're trying to look at it through the lens of how do you do it, comparing to the moderation approaches taken on Facebook, on Twitter, or even on the present day Fediverse, that's not what you're going to end up seeing, because that's actually not a model that human beings have ever lived in until we forced it upon them, or rather a bunch of corporations normalized the idea that the world would be a lot better if we let things work that way. And it doesn't, right? A globally public environment is impossible. So what I think instead is, how in our lives do we end up having community interactions? Do we end up having introductions between human beings? Do we end up growing consensual communities and intentionally governed communities, right? And there are actually a lot of flows. There's a flow that led to me ending up in this meeting, right? There's a flow that ended up to people actually joining this meeting. There's a lot of flows that end up with the things actually becoming manageable, and it's a different perspective. So if you're, I think the kind of moderation tooling, when I say that the allow list and list thing always recentralizes, and of course it does, because what ends up happening is you start out with a deny list, but then if you imagine everybody self-hosting, that's the dream, right? Everybody self-hosts. you're not gonna be able to ban the server. You're gonna ban everybody individually. It's not going to work. And then so you say, okay, we'll do allow list, and then we'll say, well, I guess we'll just allow 3 servers, and then eventually it reconverges on a thing because people can't keep up with it. So so it's a doomed approach. The global town square doesn't work with decentralized systems. So what I think we should be moving towards is how do we think about consensual interactions? And that's the kind of research we're doing on the social side in the Sprightly Institute, to have more intentional and consensual and community governed approaches to online spaces. And it's not the type of approach that you'll get from looking back on the days of what Facebook and Twitter were trying to sell us of how we should think of community and communication working.
Well, while Jazz was telling his story of potlucks, what I was thinking of was an example here in Seattle where we have a number of beaches, and one of those beaches is the nudist beach. It's pretty much the last nudist beach in Seattle. And there's a conflict going on right now where some people think they want to have like a playground next to it, and there'll be a bunch of kids, and they think it shouldn't be a nudist beach anymore. You shouldn't be allowed to have this space in the city where adults just hang out naked. And a lot of people are like, well, there's this whole conflict. Well, a lot of the beaches used to be nudist beaches, and a lot of those have been removed. This is kind of like the last one. There's a community. It's not really causing any harm. Like there's not a conflict right now. Like there aren't kids coming down to this beach. And so there's this whole, and it's a city. There's a governance structure. Like there's this city council that people go to that have elected representatives, and that's where things play out. But also like this has become pretty heated. So people on both sides of this debate are like totally going up, it's in one neighborhood. So it's like, should the people in the neighborhood decide, or is it the city overall? Because now it's the only one left. So people coming from all over want to come to that one location. People go to the press, people are lobbying to the mayor, people are lobbying to the governor. They're jumping up the governance hierarchy to try to like resolve this dispute in this neighborhood. And to be clear, it's like not like super, super heated. And there's another example I would give of this is in, San Francisco. Like, can you be naked in the street in San Francisco? Like you can be fully nude in the street in San Francisco. That's the ordinance and the law of the city of San Francisco, but it's like quite controversial. And what are the situations? It's like fairly relevant to disputes on Blue Sky about like, is full nudity allowed in what cases in this one large thing. I think it's a little like, I think our perspective is trying to come from these, like, I agree that the term like public square is like a non sequitur. It doesn't really make sense. Like that's not a thing that ever really happened. I think it's like a historical aberration, but I think there are public spaces. I think the web is a global common-ish, public-ish space that has the web structure is more that there is kind of property. There's the domain name system and there's servers, and you're responsible for what's on the server. And I think what's interesting and exciting about this newer generation of protocols and technologies is a little flatter. When the content's completely redistributable, there isn't a natural physical analogy to this space. There's not if you're just throwing graph objects out into the cloud, it's like and I don't mean, obviously if it's cloud, that's actually just someone else's server. But if it's out there on the web and it's redistributable, it becomes more ambiguous, like what space it is. I think this has been a weakness. Like Blue Sky's really focused on this and tried to make composable, stackable moderation and build a governance thing around dealing with these more public spaces and have layers and have hierarchies so that there's more local control over some things, but people can come in and out of those communities and make it all kind of work as one larger hierarchical space. I think we also need, like, a thing that's definitely lacking in the protocol and in our product is like these smaller spaces where there's a more clear, I don't know if you're really going to legalize it, it'd be like kind of like jurisdiction or like control and like a clear definition of what the purpose of that subspace is. I think the web, like what's the purpose of the web, right? There's no who runs the web and who's responsible for it. I think it's already been a big success in that it's pretty undefined.
Those were fascinating responses. I think, to me, there are parts of what the three of you said that underscore some of the distinctions between creating. I mean, I think your comment there, Brian, was getting there, is creating spaces where there's this sort of smaller scale, Christine's words were consensual or intentional community building opportunities, and where the metaphor of the potluck in your house, I think, maps quite a bit more directly, or at least something like a locally bounded set of interactions, versus this more globally kind of expansive set of interactions. At the same time, I think there's a tension, and I'm going to riff on another one of the questions as sort of a final question here, and I'll ask if the panelists, if you can make your response to this one really short, and if you want punchy, I don't know, up to you, because we're about to run out of time. But I think one way to think about this too is the distinction between creating meaningful conversations at sort of more intimate scales, and creating spaces where celebrity, where pop culture, where sort of mass cultural phenomena can thrive. And I think these were always ways in which I think what we've come to, accepting or not accept or not as sort of social media, these were always ways that, aspects of it that were sort of grinding against each other in certain senses, or maybe coexisting uncomfortably, comfortably. It may depend on time and place. So I guess, what do you think? What do you see as the most important? If you could pick one single thing that you want to see proceeding in this space to kind of build, sustained engagement, commitment, to preserve the kind of affordances for autonomy and agency that and humane interaction that you've all talked about, what do you think is that critical thing? Oh, good. I stumped them. No, I don't know.
Well, you also told us to be really quick. So any answer to that question that's quick is being recorded. I think it's vital to bear in mind. We talk about a friction between sort of the pop culture content delivery versus human interaction. And that's not new. We had that before Facebook, and we'll have it after Facebook. Sorry to name one company. Facebook is on my list because I'm in New York. There's a New York Welsh group. They only post on Facebook. I don't know what they're doing, and it really grinds my gears. And that's sort of my day to day. Like, that's why. It's not why. There's bigger reasons, but I don't consume pop culture to any great degree. I don't know. Who's influencing what with what products. But I absolutely don't want to stand in the way of people who want to consume that. And this sort of gets back to my notion of really simple social. We should just get to define what we're consuming, because the web is open, and we should be able to go to any of these tiny, medium, or large public areas and poke our head in, decide if that's where we want to be or not, and leave if we don't like to. Like freedom of association, freedom to not associate. I think it's a perceived friction, again, from a new but short-lived norm that wasn't around before these things existed and won't be around for much longer.
I don't know. This is like a vague one, but I think it touches on a couple of points. But basically, I'm most excited to just see what sustains. Like, I want to see what's gonna last. Like, what's gonna survive all of the many like threats to a community and an ecosystem, right? Like, most of our generations have seen like just the enshittification cycle over and over and over again, or the like enclosure or embrace, extend, extinguish. Like, we have all these names and these terms to refer to these patterns because they happen so often. And the Gmailification of email, like all these other patterns. And so we're like kind of trying to design things that will maybe be resilient to it, or have a different social structure, or have a different economic structure. And it's just like, what's actually gonna last of all this? Like, regardless of its peak success, like many things get very, very popular very fast. I think getting to like 500 million users or something, that's not a sign. That doesn't mean it's gonna work. I'm like things that have lasted multiple decades on the internet are like quite interesting. So like, what things are, what's the financial model? What's the mental health model for like moderation of these services over time? Are we just relying on volunteers who don't have much expertise? Are they able to organize into things like IFTAS and make this like more sustainable over time? That's I don't know. It's like the all-encompassing thing.
Well, before this call, I was remarking that I was afraid because I had this call this 90s, it says some days the best thing about my job is the chair that my chair spins. And like, it's like this, I hate Monday style cup that was given to me by an in-law who obviously doesn't know me because I love my job. And every day I wake up so excited. Um, the stuff we're doing right now, there's this problem in that it's so exciting. Like when Activity Pub was happening, I just couldn't explain it to people. But then once people experienced Mastodon, they just knew what it was, right? Like the stuff we are doing with Sprightly, I will just tell you, I think make Activity Pub, I suspect will make Activity Pub a footnote in the history of my life. It's so much more exciting. It's so thrilling. And the fact that I get to work on it every day wakes me up. I have a meeting with the engineering team and we all go, whoa, we can't believe we did this today. So if you're not paying attention, pay attention, because you're paying attention before everybody else is paying attention. It's really exciting. The stuff happening with goblins is really exciting. The stuff happening with Hoot is really exciting. And the stuff that we're going to be building on the social side is really exciting. And the stuff that's happening with OCAPN is going to change the way that people write programs that are peer-to-peer that communicate on the internet. So I'm excited about that. I'm living it every day. This mug is wrong.
That's great. The rant at the mug. We can ritualistically take it out back and smash it after the call. No, but those are great notes to end on. I really appreciate the panelists' thought and care and time and engagement on these questions. I appreciate the folks who attended and asked great questions in the Q&A. And I also want to especially thank Madison Dio, who contributed a lot of the organizing effort and energy to bring us together and make sure that the word got out and that all the infrastructure that enabled this to run smoothly was in place. So with that, thank you all so much, and thanks for joining, and look forward to seeing you again soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.